At 2:41 a.m. local time, 86 tanker trucks were moving south toward Crimea at an average speed of 37 kilometers per hour. Together, they formed a convoy nearly 17 kilometers long. Every vehicle carried the markings of a civilian milk or bottled water company. There were no armored escorts, no exposed antennas, and no soldiers visible from the road. Inside the lead truck, the convoy commander watched the spacing between vehicles and believed the disguise was still holding. From above, the column looked harmless. It was not. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the tankers were carrying an estimated 2.8 million liters of military fuel, enough to keep multiple vehicle, generator, and support units in Crimea operating for days. Just over 5 kilometers ahead, road repairs had reduced a bridge approach from 2 lanes to 1. A steel barrier closed one side. Soft ground and a drainage ditch closed the other. Once the center of the convoy entered that section, the trucks would lose the space to overtake, turn around, or scatter. Several Ukrainian FPV teams were already waiting at concealed launch sites within striking distance of the bridge approach. Their drones were still on the ground. The convoy passed an open intersection where it could still disperse. No launch order came. Then, it crossed another wide section of road. Still nothing. Stopping it earlier would have been easier. But Ukraine did not want to destroy only a few tankers. It wanted the convoy compressed inside a section where one disabled truck could close the road for everyone behind it. Ukraine was waiting for the road itself to remove every safe way out. Ukraine was not waiting on a guess. High above the road, a Leleka 100 Reconnaissance UAV was already tracking the entire column through the darkness. But the drone had not discovered it by chance. Hours earlier, Ukrainian intelligence had narrowed the search. Analysts had received a partial list of registration numbers, an estimated departure window, the planned route, and the civilian facilities the vehicles were supposedly meant to serve. The Leleka 100 had been sent to confirm whether the column below matched that profile. Its camera found no exposed weapons, no military antennas, no soldiers riding outside the cabins. The disguise was still intact. Inside the lead truck, the convoy commander saw an empty road and no reason to change the plan. So the Ukrainian operators began studying the pattern instead. The trucks held nearly identical spacing for kilometer after kilometer. None turned toward a dairy depot, a water plant, or a distribution yard. The convoy bypassed major towns and ignored the commercial stops listed in its cover route. Several tankers rode low on their rear axles, indicating that they were carrying substantial loads. Even the changes in speed were coordinated. When the lead vehicle slowed, the rest adjusted in sequence, preserving the formation instead of moving like independent civilian drivers. That coordination mattered more than the markings on the trucks. The Leleka 100 began measuring the gaps between groups and calculating when the densest section would reach the narrowed bridge approach. Ukraine did not need to identify the cargo inside every tanker. It needed to know when enough of them would lose the space to separate. The disguise survived the camera. The pattern did not. The convoy's behavior had confirmed the target. Now, the act of watching it began creating a new risk. 20 kilometers from the road, a Russian electronic warfare monitoring team linked to a Lear-3 complex detected a brief transmission in a frequency band associated with Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs. The signal was weak, too short to reveal a precise source. Then it appeared again. Each burst added another clue to the suspected transmission area. One meant little. Several, repeated from the same sector, were enough to justify a closer look. Ukraine knew the network was listening. The operators could have shut the link down immediately. They did not. Instead, a pre-positioned secondary transmitter, 3.6 kilometers from the real control team, beyond a wooded ridge, continued replaying a recorded pattern of telemetry and compressed video traffic, just enough to resemble an active UAV control link. The Russian monitoring team followed it. With every burst, the suspected area became smaller, An Orlan 10 was launched to inspect the sector with optical and thermal cameras. Near the bridge, an R-330 Zhitel station shifted its jamming effort toward the frequencies and area associated with the suspected link. Meanwhile, the Leleka 100 moved into a pre-programmed orbit, stored most of its imagery on board, and reduced its transmissions to brief scheduled updates. The real control team remained silent. Russia believed it was closing on the source. In reality, its reconnaissance and jamming were being drawn away from the sector Ukraine needed for the next phase. At 2:46 a.m., the Orlan 10 reached the suspected area above the wooded ridge. The false transmitter was still broadcasting. That was enough. The UAV circled once, then began searching with its optical and thermal cameras. Below, it found enough to support what the Russian crews already suspected: a small heat source, a battery pack, an antenna still producing short bursts of traffic. No Ukrainian control team was waiting there. Only equipment arranged to imitate an active position. The Russian operator held the image steady for several seconds, marked the coordinates, and passed them to a nearby artillery battery. Minutes later, the first round struck the ridge. The transmitter disappeared beneath dirt, fragments, and shattered electronics. The signal stopped. To the Russian crews, the sequence appeared complete. Transmission detected, suspected position verified, source destroyed. The Russian monitoring team no longer received the same traffic pattern. The Orlan 10 remained above the impact area, watching for movement. Near the bridge, the R-330 Zhitel stayed focused on the same frequencies and sector in case a backup transmitter came online. Russia believed the Ukrainian control link had been eliminated. It had not. The real Ukrainian team remained silent beyond the ridge. Above the road, the Leleka 100 continued along its programmed orbit, storing most of its imagery on board. Below, the first tankers were already slowing for the narrowed bridge approach. Russia had destroyed the signal Ukraine wanted destroyed. Now the convoy kept moving deeper into the section where space was beginning to disappear. The first tanker entered the narrowed section at barely 9 kilometers per hour. A second followed, then a third. The steel barrier forced each truck into the same lane, while the drainage ditch and soft ground removed any room to pass. Ukraine still did not launch. Inside the lead cabin, the convoy commander ordered the drivers to maintain spacing and continue through the construction zone. The road ahead appeared clear. Behind him, the column kept feeding into the bottleneck. As the lead vehicles slowed, the trucks behind them began closing the original gaps. Every minute increased the number of tankers inside the confined section. It also pushed the lead vehicles closer to open road on the far side. That was the calculation. Strike too early, and most of the convoy would remain outside the approach with enough space to stop, separate, or turn back. Wait too long, and the front group would clear the narrowed section and begin dispersing. Ukraine needed at least 30 tankers inside, enough to create a blockage the rear vehicles could not unwind quickly. After 6 minutes, 27 were in. No launch order came. After 7 minutes, the count reached 31. The number was sufficient. The geometry was not. The lead tanker had not yet reached the final bend before the narrowed section opened onto the road beyond. Ukraine needed it farther forward, close enough to seal the exit if it was disabled, but not far enough to escape onto open road. By the 8th minute, 34 tankers had been compressed into roughly 1.3 kilometers of single-lane roadway. The front was already crawling, while the rear was still closing at convoy speed. One Ukrainian operator kept counting. Ukraine did not need the entire column to stop. It needed one disabled tanker to close the only usable lane and trap every vehicle that had already committed behind it. The convoy was still moving, but the road had almost finished taking away its choices. At 2:57 a.m., the launch order finally came. 18 Ukrainian FPV drones lifted from concealed positions beyond the road and turned toward the narrowed section. Lookouts near the crossing spotted them almost immediately. Crews carrying Pishchal Pro and Stupor, handheld anti-drone jammers, moved out from covered positions. The R-330 Zhitel shifted its jamming effort back toward the frequencies and sector covering the road. Cab doors opened along the convoy. Men who had been hidden inside vehicles, marked as civilian water trucks, pulled out AK-74 rifles and Vepr 12 shotguns. The disguise was over. The attack had begun. But the 18 FPVs were not aiming for the fuel tankers packed in the middle of the column. That was what the Russian defenders expected. Instead, the formation divided. One group dived toward a tanker nearing the exit at the front of the narrowed section. The other dropped toward a tanker that had only just entered from the rear. Inside the lead cabin, the convoy commander initially believed the drones were splitting to strike more tankers at once. Jamming forced several drones off course. Rifle fire brought down others. Enough remained. The lead tanker took a hit near its front axle, veered into the steel barrier, and came to rest diagonally across the only usable lane. Seconds later, the rear tanker was struck as its driver braked hard. It stopped at an angle across the entrance, leaving too little space for the trucks behind it to pass. Both ends of the narrowed section were now effectively blocked. Between them, 34 tankers were still undamaged. No chain of explosions followed. To the Russian crews, the first attack appeared to have lost most of its drones without reaching the fuel. It had not failed. The FPVs had not been sent to destroy the fuel. They had been sent to remove movement. 18 drones had turned a moving convoy into a compressed line of nearly stationary targets. The first wave had closed the road. What came next was meant for the fuel. What Russia had seen was only the first half of the attack. While crews moved toward the two blockages, 12 Ukrainian FPV drones remained unseen. They had never joined the initial wave. They had been held back until the first wave confirmed that both ends of the narrowed section were blocked. Only then did they launch. Instead of approaching along the visible route, the reserve followed a longer path behind the drainage line and a row of abandoned structures. That route kept them outside the main observation and jamming sector, now covering the crossing. It also consumed part of their battery reserve. One Ukrainian operator watched the battery estimate fall as the drones continued along the longer route. That was the gamble. If the first wave stopped the convoy too early, the densest tanker groups would never have formed. If Russian crews cleared either blockage quickly, the reserve would not have enough power left to chase vehicles dispersing across open road. But neither had happened. Both ends of the narrowed section remained blocked. Russian soldiers were moving toward the damaged tankers. Fire crews and recovery teams were being called into the same confined lane. The R-330 Zhitel was still concentrating its jamming power on the frequencies and approach sector used during the first attack. Farther away, the Lear-3 linked monitoring team remained focused on the destroyed decoy site, while the Orlan-10 was only beginning to turn back toward the road. Each Russian defensive element had reacted to the threat it could see. Together, those reactions had left the reserve route with fewer eyes watching it and less jamming power covering it. The Leleka 100 transmitted one brief update: the convoy's final stopping point, the spacing between vehicles, and the three densest tanker groups. Then it went silent again. The 12 reserve FPVs turned toward the road. A moving convoy had required prediction. Now the targets could no longer move. The reserve reached the road under heavier fire than Ukraine had expected. Russian defenses were working. A Pishchal Pro crew disrupted the control link of the first FPV. The drone rolled away from the convoy and struck the drainage ditch. Seconds later, a Stupor operator forced another off course. Rifle fire damaged two more. For the Russian soldiers below, every drone knocked off course appeared to prove the defense was regaining control. But every new defensive response pushed more men, vehicles, and equipment deeper into the same confined lane. Soldiers spread between the tankers to gain clearer firing angles. A recovery truck moved toward the damaged lead tanker. A fire truck stopped near the rear blockage. The space between the fuel tanks narrowed even further. Broken drone parts fell onto the road. Men shouted warnings across idling engines. The corridor was becoming more crowded with every attempt to defend it. The surviving FPVs dropped lower. One Ukrainian operator chose not to climb above the tankers, even though the lower route left almost no room to correct an error. The drones moved between the tanker roofs and the steel barrier, forcing Russian shooters to change their angles. A missed burst could now hit one of the tankers or the men positioned beside it. Expanding the jamming coverage risked disrupting Russian radios and other electronic equipment already operating inside the bottleneck. Then interference from the Zhitel began tearing through the remaining video feeds. The images froze, returned, and broke apart again. As the jamming intensified, 4 more drones were lost to broken links, late corrections, and rifle fire. By the time the formation entered its final approach, only 4 remained. The last usable telemetry showed none with more than 4% battery remaining. The nearest tanker cluster was less than 300 meters away. Russia had destroyed most of the reserve, but every successful defense had reduced the number of drones, and also the number of safe choices left to the men below. The 4 surviving FPVs crossed the final 300 meters almost together. Their batteries were nearly exhausted, and 2 video feeds were already breaking apart. There would be no second approach. The first FPV struck a tanker near the center of the densest group. Fuel began leaking across the roadway as fire took hold beneath the damaged vehicle. The second struck another tanker at the rear of the same cluster. The spreading fire and leaking fuel forced soldiers and drivers away from the trucks they had been trying to protect. The third FPV turned toward the recovery truck near the front blockage. Its detonation disabled the vehicle before it could pull the damaged lead tanker clear. The front of the corridor remained closed. The final FPV struck exposed auxiliary equipment beside the Zhitel position near the crossing. The Zhitel remained operational, but its coverage no longer held the same sector. The crew was forced to reposition away from the fire and disconnect damaged equipment. Ukraine had not destroyed all 86 tankers. Several vehicles that had already cleared the front of the narrowed section escaped onto open road. Many at the rear had never entered the bottleneck. But the convoy could no longer deliver its fuel on schedule or as a single organized formation. The road was blocked. Recovery equipment had been disabled. Fire crews could no longer reach the center safely. A substantial share of the convoy's estimated 2.8 million liters was now burning, held inside disabled tankers, or trapped behind a corridor that could not be cleared quickly. Moving another convoy through the same route would require wider spacing, earlier electronic warfare coverage, heavier escorts, and longer checks at every bottleneck. That time would become another cost. The trucks had hidden behind civilian paint. The trap had hidden inside the road. Ukraine did not need to destroy every truck. It only needed to make the convoy incapable of completing its mission. So what matters more in modern warfare? Destroying every target, or slowing the entire system until it can no longer do its job?